Deceiving ourselves with logical fallacies, the impact of willing ignorance. That's the subject I want to cover today because we are critically advised under the direction of Jesus Christ and the apostles to stick to the truth. As we heard in the song that we just heard for special music, simple and true. Don't make it complicated. If we could turn initially to Romans 11 and verse 25. In Romans 11:25, I didn't have this in my original notes, but here it is where the description of our calling into the truths of God in Romans 11:25. I want to read the first half of the verse because it pertains to what we're doing today. How we are brought, because it describes how we're brought into the truth. For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own opinion. They must be talking about me, somebody who thinks they're wise in their own opinion, and yet we're told, don't be ignorant of what God has in mind for us. Then I would like to turn to 2 Corinthians 2:11, because we should study. We shouldn't be ignorant of what God has in store for us. In 2 Corinthians 2:11, Paul writes to the church at Corinth, lest you should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. We're talking about Satan. We have to be careful not to be ignorant of what will distract us from what is simple and true, the calling that we have been given by God. So part of that is, how do we make those decisions? So in order to honor God, we must use wise reasoning. And here we're looking at Romans chapter 1 and verses 21 and 22. And this one I'm going to read in the Common English Bible. Although they knew God, they didn't honor God as God or thank him. Instead, their reasoning became pointless. Ever hear anybody whose reasonings became pointless because they didn't understand the truths of God? And we read on, and their foolish hearts were darkened. While they were claiming to be wise, they made fools of themselves. So without the truths of God, people can strut around in their ignorance. Their arguments are pointless because they don't understand the truths of God. And their reasoning is unsound. So I want to take a look at our capacity to use solid biblical reasoning so that we don't claim to be wise and yet show ourselves to be a fool. We don't want to be deceived, really, and that's really what we're looking at, is to avoid being deceived. Well, I've titled this about logical fallacies, so it's fair to ask, what is a logical fallacy? Well, it is an idea that people believe to be true, but in fact it's false because it's based on an incorrect information or reasoning. Now, frequently we find that people choose to avoid the truth. And so logical fallacies are some of the tools that they use to remain willingly ignorant. Well, they think thus and such, therefore it must be so. So this is a willing ignorance, and we have to avoid being willingly ignorant. Because if we don't, we can deceive ourselves. And yes, that's possible for all of us. In James chapter 1 and verse 22, and James 1:22, again in the Common English Bible, you must be doers of the word and not only hearers. But the verse doesn't stop there. Who mislead themselves. So if it just goes in one ear and out the other, we can mislead ourselves. We think we know something, but have we really put it to the test? Well, we can't rely on somebody else to solve all of these issues because we are individually responsible. In 2 Timothy 2:15, again in the Common English Bible, make an effort to present yourself to God as a tried and true worker who doesn't need to be ashamed, but is one who interprets the message of truth correctly. We can't simply throw up our hands and say, God is in charge and I really don't have to do anything. We are called to make decisions, and God can't use people who refuse to make good decisions. So we're going to take a look now at some of the fallacies or the ways that people mislead themselves or allow themselves to be misled, and that will take us away from the truth. The first area I'm going to cover is what we call an ad hominem fallacy. Now, those of you that aren't briefed in Latin, ad hominem means to or toward or against, and hominem the man. So against the man, so against the person. This fallacy is often used to describe name-calling or a personal attack. And it occurs when someone attacks the person instead of attacking his or her argument. In other words, they blast an individual, say that they don't like who they are for whatever reason, so they will blast the person. Well, he's from on the wrong side of the tracks. Or, I never did like dark hair. Or, I never liked blue eyes. Or whatever it happens to be, they're attacking the person instead of the argument. You say, wait a minute, we don't want to argue. Hold on. Stop the presses. An argument, however, does not mean a knockdown, drag-out fight. When we're talking in this environment of this discussion, an argument simply means reasoned discourse, presenting the pros and the cons of an idea or an issue. So you're looking, should we or should we not? And so we would call that a logical argument. Should we make a decision? And every day we make decisions. We make them all day, every day. Sometimes it's not to decide, not to make a decision is in fact the decision. Because we avoid making a decision, that becomes a decision. So the ad hominem fallacies, now there are several kinds of ad hominem fallacies, but let's take a look at Ephesians 4:29, again in the Common English Bible version. In Ephesians 4:29, don't let any foul words come out of your mouth. Only say what is helpful when it is needed for building up the community so that it benefits those who hear what you say. So if somebody is trying to address an argument or a decision, and they do the foul words or the name calling, or I don't like somebody just because I don't like them, that's not helpful, and that doesn't even deal with the issue. It's against the person, as the ad hominem fallacy directs. So let's take a look. There are several kinds of ad hominem fallacies against the persons individually. And the first one is abusive. This is where the person is directly attacked. Let's turn to Proverbs 30 and verse 33. In the New King James Version, in Proverbs 30, verse 33. For as the churning of milk produces butter, and the wringing of the nose produces blood, so the forcing of wrath produces strife. So, if somebody says something really saucy, are you inclined to believe them? Or you kind of get your ire built up a little bit? How do you handle that? Or does it work when you do that to somebody else? For example, you present what you thought was a great idea, and you've thought it out, and you've presented it all, and Rodney Dangerfield comes up and says, you're dumb and ugly and your mother dresses you funny. How well are you going to receive that argument? Did they address the issue at all? No, they just addressed what they thought of you. So the statement says nothing about the other person's ideas. They just don't like you for whatever imagined, or they may never have met you for whatever real or imagined reason. Instead, it serves to mock or demean the other person. So the fallacy, number one, ad hominem fallacy, is abusive. Just come right out boldly. And do we see this very often? Oh, yes. Especially where? Social media. And if you ever want a version of you're dumb and ugly and your mother dresses you funny, just go to any forum on social media and you're going to see pretty much the same kind of argument. And we know that's a fallacious argument. It's false because they don't address the issue at hand. The next kind of ad hominem fallacy is circumstantial. A circumstantial fallacy means that personal circumstances motivates a person's arguments, so it must be false. And I would turn to Proverbs 16 and verse 2 in the New King James. In Proverbs 16 and verse 2, all the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirits. You have somebody that comes up and says, well, you're just saying thus and such because you or your family will benefit from the decision, from that outcome. While the statement may in fact benefit you or your family or somebody you know, that's not an analysis of why that should be done or shouldn't be done. They refuse to directly address the issue. Instead, they're saying, well, I don't have your problems. I don't have the same benefit coming to me like you would. And so that's purely, and maybe incidental that the circumstances may benefit for whatever argument that is. So now let's take a look. And so the second type of fallacy, ad hominem fallacy, is circumstantial. Just happens to be that way. The third kind of ad hominem fallacy is guilt by association. Ooh, we ever seen that before? Due to an association to something negative, an argument is discredited. In Mark 2 and verse 16, we have an example of that, Mark 2:16. Because if it's guilt by association, if you can tell somebody, well, you're not believable because you hang around with the wrong people. Therefore, what kind of judgment do you have? Your argument can't possibly hold water because, and we have this example here in Mark 2:16. And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him, meaning Jesus, eating with the tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, how is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners? What's the implication here? Something's wrong with this guy. Who can believe him? So we have this guilt by association because who is Christ hanging around? Tax collectors, fallen women, and other sinners. Well, we have this where they were constantly describing, the Pharisees were, and negating the people that Jesus Christ would associate with. We can turn to Luke 18, and we can read the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And I would want to, let's go to Luke 18, and starting in verse 9. Luke 18 and verse 9, and he spoke this parable to someone who trusted in themselves and that they were righteous. Ever met anybody who said pretty well trusted in themselves that they were righteous? And they despised others. So now we're going to see the example that Christ gave in verse 11. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Verse 11, the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you, I am not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. So he could clearly see who was there, this despicable tax collector. And frankly, tax collectors working for the Roman Empire were not very nice people. They had a lot of power, they had a lot of authority, and they sometimes extorted more than what they should have. And yet, there was a tax collector at the temple in a repentant mode. And so now we take a look at this Pharisee who is saying, verse 12, I fast twice a week. I give tithes at all I possess. In other words, look how righteous I am. And he's saying this, saying these things to himself, patting himself on the back. And now we go to verse 13. And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He was saying, I don't belong here. I'm truly sorry for the kind of sinner I am, and I'm hoping for mercy, praying for mercy. So now, verse 14, what does Christ say? I tell you, this man, meaning the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other, meaning the Pharisee. For everyone who calls himself, exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So what was the Pharisee doing? He was exalting himself. I'm not like that, that Pharisee, whoever is, or the tax collector over there. I'm a righteous Pharisee. I do all these good things. And people then do what? They deceive themselves. So now you have this attitude that comes up therefore, if you're righteous and you look around and you're surrounded and you see all these unrighteous people, So anybody that associates with them, you would say guilt by association. So, and then therefore, who can believe anything they say because they're associating with those kind of people? The fourth kind of ad hominem fallacy, and this is a fancy word, tu quoque, and this device or this fallacy, personal fallacy, is that past actions discredit your argument. And I'll give you an example. You previously had dinner with someone who was later found to be a bad person. And here's the photograph to prove that you had dinner with this bad person. They did a bad thing, and therefore we can't believe anything you say because your past actions, not just to associate with them, or something that you said when you were 14 years old, and now that you're 64 years old, we're going to use that against you because of your past actions. Matthew 15, verses 1 through 3. Then the scribes and the Pharisees, who were from Jerusalem, came to Jesus, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they don't wash their hands when they eat bread." Now, I might interject here that the washing of hands was ceremonial. It's not that they weren't clean and they just came out from fixing the tractor and crawled out from behind underneath a combine or whatever other farm equipment that they didn't have back then and said, "Oh, we're grubby, so we'll just come and eat the sandwiches and leave the marks." That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about a ceremonial washing. And the ceremonial washing is true in many religions. When in Japan, visiting several times and going to whether it's a Buddhist or Shinto temple, they will have a little fountain outside. And frequently it's a fountain of a little dragon with the water coming out of its mouth, and you're required to wash yourself ceremonially before you go into that temple as a ceremonial cleansing. No different here. They were adopting extra biblical beliefs and not eating this. And so, therefore, they're saying, their actions discredit them. This is what the Pharisees were saying. And your disciples, they clearly discredit themselves. Well, we read in verse 3 what Christ responded with in Matthew 13 and verse 3. He, meaning Jesus, answered and said to them, "Why do you also trespass the commandment of God because of your tradition?" He's calling them out for it. Their tradition was tradition, not the doctrines of God, or the commandments of God. They were adopting the doctrines of men. So he was turnabout for them, or they were busy blaming others, saying, "Look what you're not doing. Shame on you. You should be doing thus and such." And they were upbraiding Christ. You should straighten these people out. They're not doing what they should be doing. So the past actions discredit your argument on tu quoque of the four kinds. So the four kinds of arguments against the person are ad hominem arguments. Four types of ad hominem fallacies. The abusive, where the person is directly attacked. Circumstantial. Personal circumstances motivates a person's argument, so it must be false. You might seem to benefit from this. Now, to be fair, some people do propose things for which they will benefit significantly from. This is part of our judgment. We have to take a look. But let's look at it on the basis of the idea or the issue or the doctrine or whatever it is that's at issue, and not just because it's circumstantial. Third is guilt by association. Due to an association to something negative, the argument is discredited. Well, and it's sort of like the town gossip was at the local ladies club was talking about old Ernie. He was the town drunk, and she knew it, and it was so because his car was parked in front of the bar, and therefore, no good could come of that. And so the word went all over town that Ernie was a town drunk. And it wasn't long. The next night, Ernie drove his old truck and he parked it in front of the town gossip's house. And then he walked home, left the truck in front of her house all night. Now, what do you suppose the expectation was for all the people that believed in guilt by association? Well, if we associate where he parked his car, one time we're going to take the next association there. So guilt by association, also a fallacious argument. And the fourth one, tu quoque, past actions discredit your argument. Just because you said something when you were 14 or 24, 34, 44, however long it was ago, now therefore you are discredited from saying anything against. You can't ever change your mind. You can't ever see the truth and understand or have a greater understanding. So we have those kinds, four kinds of against the person or ad hominem fallacies. Now there are other ones that we can be deceiving ourselves or let others deceive us. A lot of times we don't even realize that these things are doing. We just fall right into it. Just listen to the news, and they're using most of these that I'm going to discuss today. That you'll watch and you'll be able to identify them. One of these is called the red herring fallacy. Now, the red herring fallacy, this is an attempt to divert attention away from the issue at hand, the relevant issue, and introducing another issue that's not relevant. In other words, they're switching the subject. It's intentionally made to distract, as a distraction, to take the argument or the issue, move it to a different issue, because that one's easier to respond to. You see that in almost every political interview you will find. They will change the question to something else that will distract you. Now, my German grandfather, with very little patience, as a little kid that was under 10 years old, he took us fishing. Fishing requires patience. And my grandfather had 5 brothers-in-law. My grandmother was the eldest of 8, and 5 younger brothers. They all worked as hired men for my grandfather through the Depression, and they all were avid fishermen. Every day of their lives that they could get on the lake, they would do it. And in the winter, too, on ice fishing, whenever they could, they could. My grandfather didn't have time for fishing. But for whatever reason, one time he took us fishing. So it was memorable that he took us fishing. And what I learned was, in fishing, that the lures have a shiny side to them. So when they flip around, there's a shiny part that will attract the fish. And the fish will go for the lure, and there's a hook hanging on there, and attracts the fish. Well, that's how the fish got hooked, is they saw a shiny thing. So a red herring would be something that distracts from what you were attempting to do. So therefore, how do you deal with that? Well, you have 3 options. You can accept the new topic, ignore the original subject, and that's what a lot of people do. They get suckered into the new topic and move on. Or you can just disengage with the argument. Realize that the other person is trying to deceive you or mislead you off into that. You just let it go. I would say that that's probably my most popular engagement or disengagement. Or third, you can straighten them out and insist on the original topic. Now, reporters are paid to do that. Do they do it? Not so much. Okay? And if they do, well, then they're earning their pay for staying on point, staying on target. If we take a look in Matthew 15, verses 1 and 2. Matthew 15, verses 1 and 2. We have this, we've already discussed about washing the hands. When the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, for they do not wash their hands when they eat bread? This I put into the red herring is because what's the real issue? The people were there to learn about the truth, and what were the Pharisees doing? Well, let's go talk about washing hands. Okay, let's not talk about the truths of God. Let's switch the subject to a different topic. That way we do not have to deal with what God expects of us. We'll just deal with what we expect of the other people, like your disciples, to do in the washing of hands. And so if we read then in Matthew further in 15, we see how Jesus answers the questions. He turns it around on them, as we read earlier. So we can't be distracted from the truths of God by getting tied up in knots over issues that aren't essential to our salvation. Ever have those distractions? How many angels can fit on the head of a pin? Well, that's an interesting question, right? Can God make a rock so big even he can't lift it? And those kinds of things that distract us so far away from the things that are essential for salvation that it gets our brain twitter-pated in a different direction. There's another, and so the red herring fallacy is a distraction. Takes us away to a different area. Then we have something called the straw man fallacy. Now, the straw man fallacy is committed when a person simply ignores a person's actual position, and then they substitute in a distorted or exaggerated or misrepresented version of that position. Now, they do that by overstating what you think. What you're really saying is, and then they state something that isn't true. That's not what you really said. They overstate it and they create or misrepresent something that in order for them to more easily attack or refute it. So this easy attack, because, well, what you're really saying is that you really are dumb and ugly and your mother dresses you funny. They've stated it into a different, into a different way, and then they attack that new way that is easier for them to answer. And again, you can accept this straw man. People will put up a straw man because it's easier, that argument. It's easier to knock that one down than it is to deal with the issue that you brought up or that was a matter of discussion. So we don't have this whole, and you can identify the straw man arguments that people put up because they're distracting. If we turn to Titus chapter 3 and verse 9. In Titus chapter 3 and verse 9, we read this instruction from Paul. But avoid foolish disputes, genealogies, contentions, and strivings about the law, for they're unprofitable and useless. Ooh. Don't fall for it. If somebody is trying to get you engaged in something else, and I think this was nearly 20 years ago, I gave a sermon in Fort Smith, and it's got to be close to 20 years ago. And it had to do with a lot with inheritance. And I got a letter afterwards from somebody saying, now how do we deal with all these inheritance issues? And this verse came to mind, that they were dealing with all of these troubling inheritance issues. Not that it was wrong to sort that through. It's better to have families sorted out and you never have the issue, those kinds of things. But I looked through it and I thought, how unprofitable and useless the strivings would be, because when you're all done with it, what has everybody done? They've alienated each other, arguing over things that aren't worth the argument and distracting from reality. So the apostle here refuses to fall into the straw man fallacy trap. He advises simply avoid the traps. So if somebody brings up a straw man argument, some artificial thing that they want to knock down, Paul said just avoid those arguments. And if that's all some people have, sometimes I guess you could extend it to avoiding the people that do that. Then there's another fallacy, and we call it the bandwagon fallacy. A bandwagon fallacy is a type of argumentative fallacy that's based on an appeal to popular belief and behavior. It's not because it's valid or logical, but because, everybody does it. Everybody believes thus and such, so it must be true. Or everybody else does it. Must be right, the right thing to do. We've seen a lot of this in the last few years. An example of this that we've seen all our lives are Christmas and Easter, Valentine's, going to church on Sunday. Those are just things that people do. Everybody does that. You should all know that, right? Isn't that what everybody up and down the street, if they go to church, they're going to do those things? And so we have this, get on the bandwagon or something's wrong with you because you're going to miss out on that. Well, and it reminds me of my cousin who had a little bumper sticker on his pickup truck, and he raised sheep, and he said, a little bumper sticker said, eat lamb, 3 million coyote, can't be wrong. Get on the bandwagon. Let's all get there. And of course, he was selling sheep. So The following the popular belief. In the last couple of years, with the whole health scenario, there's a lot of bandwagons out there. Bandwagon, you guys have seen the parades, right? Where you have the band playing on the wagon and you're all supposed to cheer and follow along with that. And if you don't, well, what's wrong with you? There must be something wrong if you don't jump on the bandwagon. Well, there's an alternative way to say this on the bandwagon fallacy. If everyone doesn't do thus and such, therefore doing such and such must be wrong. This is why many people have a hard time keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, because surely not everyone else could be wrong. And I suspect every one of you have heard this somewhere along the way. If we turn to Matthew in chapter 7 of verse 13. In Matthew 7 and verse 13 in the New King James version, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And there are many who go in by it. It's referring to the broad way, just on the bandwagon. They're going along with the crowd. Or as I've heard it say another way, only the live fish swim upstream. The dead fish go with the flow. Okay, so that's really what we're looking at is if you are going to be vigorous with the truth, then you're going to enter by the narrow gate. You have to narrow your choices down to the accuracy of the truths that are boldly stated in the Bible. And then we've got the fallacy called a slippery slope fallacy. Slippery slope, it's an argument that refers to, it's a logical fallacy, meaning there's a flaw in the reasoning that weakens the argument. In other words, if someone asserts a certain proposition or an action, an idea, it must be rejected because it would have unintended consequences. And then that would lead to a disastrous outcome. Now, to bear in mind, many decisions that people make do lead to disastrous outcomes. And the older we get, the more disastrous outcomes we can see because we have experience. They say under age 25, the prefrontal cortex of the brain is not fully developed. So insurance rates are high for those who are actually under 26 years of age, so that because they don't have that judgment, the cause and effect differentiation. They don't relate the two. And so here the slippery slope is like a domino effect. If this, then that, and then if this, and then that, and it can get out of hand. And like I say, sometimes this is true, but often the technique is used to exaggerate the original projected outcome. Reminds me as a young teen, I grew up on a farm in Minnesota, and you may have heard that there is winter in Minnesota once in a while. And we relished playing in the snow with the outside activities, but we didn't have mountains to ski on in our area, and our hills, the farm didn't have steep hills. So, so we couldn't go sledding, just very small, gentle knolls. But we did have a tractor with a hydraulic scoop bucket. And so we would scoop up the snow and make a huge pile of snow below the granary roof. Now, the granary roof is pretty steep. So we pile the snow up there. Now, Dad's not home, because we know how to run tractors. We pile the snow up, and then we take an extension ladder, 28-foot extension ladder, and we run it at the angle up the steep roof, and we can get pretty close to the top. And now we got a walkway to get up there, and now we can take the sled up there, and we can come zingity-doo-dah down the roof, shoot through the air, land on the snowbank that we've created, and off we go and have a grand old time. There's a technical problem there, and that is the woods are a little bit too close to the granary. So it didn't take too much time to figure out that we had to kind of put a bank on the angle of that when you hit that flying down. I'm thinking of Calvin and Hobbes cartoons where they come flying down the hill and just ungood things happen. So and then, of course, it only took a few runs and the snow was worn off the roof. Aha! It's below freezing out. The well and the hydrant are just 30 feet away. So go get the hose, run the hose up to the roof, spray the roof with water. It'll freeze to ice very shortly. Put the hose away so there's no evidence. And Dad's not home yet. And so spray the roof. Now, when you climb up the ladder with the sled, you can really zingity-doo die. Why we didn't die, I'm not sure. But our knowledge of physics was incomplete. But somehow it all worked. We went down the slippery slope. Now, can you imagine my parents if they would have been watching all of that? And it wasn't long when Dad got home. He forbid climbing on the extension ladder onto the roof. Just let it all be. Now, the ice wasn't really very thick. And I couldn't disguise what we were doing because the back pockets on my pants were ripping on the nails on the shingles of the cedar shingles on the roof. I never caught my skin, but it ripped the backside of the pants off. So there was evidence that we were doing up there. But the slippery slope is often used by pessimists to validate their concerns on every issue. Well, if you do this, bad things are going to happen. And you know what? There are times when bad things do happen when making decisions. But that doesn't discredit everything all the time. And so we have to be careful with regard to using this slippery slope fallacy that it always works. Let's take a look at Proverbs 26, verse 13. We saw a lot of this in the last 2 years. Proverbs 26, verse 13. The lazy man says, there's a lion in the road. A fierce lion is in the streets. Meaning, I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. It's too dangerous. It's a slippery slope. Why? If I step myself out the door, I'm at risk. And then I could get eaten by the lion. So our job is to evaluate the reality of the situation and come to a rational conclusion, not simply be misled by our initial fears. To take a look a little deeper than somebody who's claiming a slippery slope and all the bad things that are going to happen to you. There's another fallacy, and that's called the appeal to nature fallacy. Appeal to nature is a logical fallacy that occurs when something is claimed to be good because it's perceived as natural, or bad because it's perceived to be unnatural. Natural good, unnatural bad. Well, so the assumption is if it's part of the natural world, it must be good. And it demonstrates this is, and that's a feature, and that's how we should interact with the world. Well, folks, I don't go swimming when there are sharks in the water. That's part of the natural world, so I can't say that's good, okay? In fact, I don't get in the bathtub unless I can see clear to the bottom. I'm not taking chances here, okay? And most of the sharks feed within the first 2 feet of water, because animals climb out there. But an appeal to nature, for example, we don't see the wheel in nature, but that doesn't make the wheel bad. Just because the use of the wheel is bad because it's unnatural. So we have to be careful of this argument about appealing to nature. And if natural is good, then unnatural is bad. We can take a look, and we go back to Genesis 1:31. And Genesis 1:31, when upon creation, this was after the 6th day of creation, and God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. I'm going to cut it off there because that's my point, is that God said it was good. He didn't say that it was bad. He said what's in nature was good, but let's continue on. What else did God say? He said in Genesis 2, verse 15, Genesis 2:15, then the Lord God took man, put him in the Garden of Eden to just exist, eat the low-hanging fruit, and enjoy life. What did he say? To tend and keep it. Well, it didn't say just let everything rot and go to pieces. Tend and keep it means pruning the vines and the vineyards or whatever whatever they're growing. So this whole idea of just abandoning nature to itself without a duty for man can cause you to fall into the appeal to nature fallacy. So let's be careful about the appeal to nature, that we have a responsibility to tend and keep what God has given us. Okay, so let's look back here. What is a logical fallacy? A fallacy is an idea which many people believe to be true, but in fact false, because it's based on incorrect information or reasoning. We've looked at a number of logical fallacies. We've looked at the ad hominem, against the person fallacy. We've looked at the red herring, the distraction. We looked at straw man, a substitute. We looked at the bandwagon effect. Hey, let's go along with the crowd. The slippery slope. Well, if you do that, bad things are going to happen. Really, really bad things. I might interject and have it in my notes, but I have a Protestant sister-in-law who is just sure that we're going to burn in hell because she's going down the slippery slope. Because if we don't go to church on Sunday, etc., once we go down that path, we're going to be boiled in oil or whatever else you can dream up. And then there's, of course, the appeal to nature, that everything in nature is always good all the time. And if we do anything contrary to that, then we're falling into our own fallacy. Now, I go over these logical fallacies because this isn't for someone else. This is for us, our individual responsibility. In 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 21 and 22, test all things, hold fast that which is good, abstain from every form of evil. That's a pretty bold level of responsibility. We can't say, we'll turn it over to somebody else, let them make the decisions as to whether or not something is true or not. We have to do the proving of it ourselves. It is our own individual responsibility. And so let's grip this individual responsibility. Know when we read a newspaper, listen to the radio, watch television, scan anything on the internet, discussing with friends, discussing with non-friends, that there must be a way for us to evaluate whether or not we are being subjected to a logical fallacy, and even worse, that we are not repeating them. So let's take that responsibility upon ourselves so that we can grow and be better Christians.